Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Politics Relaxed. Another week, another Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak is now the Prime Minister. Last week it was Liz Truss, and we were reflecting on how terribly she done. This week we're probably going to talk about Rishi Sunak, what we think his premiership's going to look like, what his cabinet looks like, and what that's going to mean.
I mean, I think there's stuff to take confidence in from the early days of his premiership right now, but there's also stuff that I feel concerned about. I mean, if I start on the positives, I think his decision to delay the fiscal statement was pretty positive. I've read somewhere from the Treasury that we're going to save 16 billion from that, delaying it up to 17th of November, which I think is obviously something we can take confidence in. I think he's united the Conservative Party now just on a general basis, and that comes from his decisions in the cabinet. I think whatever you think about Suella Braverman, his decision to put her back in the cabinet as kind of the representative of a faction which he needed to desperately get the support of, I think he can take confidence from that. Um, I mean, more generally, the today's news about him not going to COP27 concerns me. I think at a time where we need action from all political leaders around the world on such a issue which carries such importance over the next decades of our lives, I think him not being there is going to be pretty concerning.
Yeah. And
Right, right. Well, I think we all watched PMQs, and I kind of made like a tally list of what went wrong and what didn't go wrong. He seemed pretty confident during PMQs. It wasn't too disastrous. I think you can sum it up as being okay. I think the Conservatives are back at their old stomping ground, and the whole scroungers versus strivers, and the tough on defence and strong on immigration, which I think is a smart move for Rishi Sunak, considering that I think it was 60% of the votes that they've lost in 2019. They left because of the immigration policy under Truss. So I think it's a smart move to go down. I think where he struggled really was non-dom, and I think that's something that made him really visibly uncomfortable during PMQs. And I think that Labour might have to adjust their strategy a bit and really head down that road with Rishi Sunak, because he's a bit more difficult to handle than Liz Truss was, who kind of blinked as a form of response.
mm,
Rishi Sunak kind of he speaks, unfortunately, and unfortunately a lot of his comebacks were quite sound. So I think if Labour want to carry on, and I think they'll do fine against Rishi Sunak. I think non-dom is a good one. I think going down, him not being a representative of the working class, and obviously we've all seen that video about the deprived urban areas. That's one that Keir Starmer needs to head down a bit strongly, I think.
I think it's interesting on PMQs. I mean, I think we knew he was going to be a strong performer. He's obviously got experience as chancellor doing budgets and things like that. So yeah, I don't think that was particularly a surprise. I think it was interesting how similar it felt to watching a Boris Johnson versus Keir Starmer PMQ performance, though, because you had him going down these same lines that I think are very well travelled at this point, with the kind of Jeremy Corbyn line, which is very much distracting from the question. I don't know how much that's going to work. I think it'll be interesting to tell. And again, I don't know how much PMQs matters, because how much does it actually cut through? That's an interesting question. It's interesting to look at the poll bounce. He's had a bit of a poll bounce. I think that was kind of to be expected. He's obviously more confident
Yeah.
than us. I think that was Labour are not going to hold on to the sort of poll leads that we saw under Liz Truss. That's self-evident, I think. But I'm not too concerned, because I think, again, what Danielle mentioned about the non-dom stuff and about how out of touch he is, I think that's going to be the election loser for the Conservatives, will be how out of touch he is, especially with kind of the cost of living stuff. I think that those two together, I don't know if people will like that at all.
Well, I think he's stable until the next election, at least 2024 or whatever. It's I mean, even just a few days after he's been appointed, the talk of an election has gone down considerably, and that's because he's united the party. I mean, I say that. Who knows what's going to happen? But I think rebellions are a lot less likely in these coming weeks than they were under Liz Truss, because, well, let's be honest here, she wasn't supposed to win the first Conservative leadership election. I mean, that gives him what, 2 years to put through whatever. That's probably about a similar amount of time to Boris Johnson, except without COVID. But we've got a different crisis now, the cost of living one, which is a bit more normal in politics, I guess. But
Yeah.
of course, that remains to be seen. He's staying away from COP27 to focus on the economy, which, I mean, yeah, is an interesting logic, considering he still does have to interact with other leaders because he is himself a world leader. But the COP is, well, I wonder if King Charles is going to go now that Liz Truss isn't around anymore to stop him. Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the wider point as well about kind of Rishi Sunak's overall foreign policy. We really don't know what that's going to look like. Obviously, I think the support for Ukraine will probably stay where it is, and I don't think that's likely to change. But I feel like, I mean, for example, if we look at America, how are we going to see like a trade deal done with America finally? Probably not, but and there's like India, we've been looking to do a trade deal with for a long, long time. Will he further relations there, or will he hinder them? I think that remains to be seen on his foreign policy. I think it'll be interesting to look at over the coming kind of months.
Yeah, well, we don't know much about Rishi Sunak, and that is one of the key issues. And I think he's trying to rectify that through his cabinet, which I know we'll talk about later. Yeah. But he's relatively new. I think his last most notable position was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I think with foreign policy, we're very quite, grey on what he's doing, which could be an advantage because he's not got any huge stains on his past like Jeremy Hunt. But we'll see.
Mm.
I think often issues like foreign policy, especially we're in the cost of living crisis right now, issues like foreign policy can often get pushed to the backlogs of what we determine as top priorities. I think we forget that there is a war in Ukraine still going on, and we need to we can shift our opinion on it when the fight's still going. But the problem that I think Rishi Sunak has got is trying to come together and solve areas that have got so much problems in it. I think education's underfunded, health's underfunded, trying to sort out the cost of living crisis as a whole right now. I think when he came into power as prime minister, his first priority was to restore trust within his own party. I think while we don't have factual proof of that yet, I think the consensus is out that he's got a lot of trust right now. And I think we'll talk about the cabinet, obviously, where I'll make my point that his selection of people in the cabinet it represents all factions of the Tory party. But what he needs to do now is he needs to come up with a game plan where he can kind of set out goals that can kind of benefit everyone.
I think.
Yeah. I think the only issue with that is that I don't think he's got much movement with the economy, because he either goes kind of two ways, which is tax rises, which always, causes a bit of, the backbenchers tend to have a bit of a paddy over tax rises. And the issue with Rishi Sunak hiking up taxes is that he doesn't have a great reputation with tax rises, given the last time he tried to hike up national insurance tax and he fell out with tons of people in the Conservative Party. Yeah. And then if he goes down the route of public spending cuts, the optics of that just don't look great, because he's one of the richest members of parliament. The NHS, these key services are already underfunded. If he goes down the kind of the path of public spending cuts, it doesn't reflect too well on him.
Yeah, I think he is going to go down the route of public spending cuts, which is concerning. I saw a report, I think it was Politico, but I can't quite remember, saying that it's going to be about 10 to 15% in every single department, which is just, it's so damaging. And I was also kind of looking into this because I was like, what is the alternative? Is there an alternative to this? And there is an alternative. And it's Tax Justice UK, they're called. They've got this full kind of article which sets out how you can raise £37 billion just through kind of taxes. And it's through, like, for example, what Labour have called for, which is an end to non-dom status. There's so many different things you can do to kind of raise this tax money, which I think is the only way if I'm looking at it, just because of the state of the NHS, the state of education, the state of policing, the state of the whole public services right now are so desperately underfunded already that they cannot deal with a 10 to 15% cut.
Absolutely. Even though he promised to, I also I'd be cautious about his promise to increase 50,000 police officers. The Tories have been promising that since 2004, and the police sector is still, very underfunded. So I wouldn't buy into that too much.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we look at the cabinet now. We've been kind of tiptoeing around it so that we get to this point. It was surprising. I'll tell you that much. I was rather surprised with a lot of the appointments. I think it was, as Finlay said, a unifying cabinet. But is a unifying cabinet the right cabinet? Remains to be seen.
Well, I mean, is there any right cabinet for you, Felix? I mean, other than a Labour one, you've criticised every single one since we started this thing.
Because they're all terrible
for various reasons, and that's understandable from your point of view, I guess, and mine in some instances. It's very much partly Liz Truss, even though she didn't have any support in the party to begin with. So I don't know. I guess he just wants to keep some of them anyway. Suella Braverman is a strange one to keep around. And James Cleverly is in for, and that's fine. Who cares? But who else? Who's in education?
Gillian? Is it Gillian Keegan?
I think it is, yeah, Gillian.
Yeah,
and it's like what the 8th education secretary in a year or something. Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's
14 months. The set, yeah,
14 months. And that's that doesn't bode well for the education sector, especially with the possibility of spending cuts.
Yeah, sure.
See what Keegan has to do about that.
Yeah, I do think of course I think I'm fair enough, but I do think I'm actually fair enough to criticize this cabinet, especially because I was reading an article. There are 16 ministerial code breaks in this cabinet. 16 different people that have broken ministerial code in the cabinet. It's an article by the Yorkshire Bylines. I enjoyed reading it last night. So you can go and read it if you want. There is a lot of people that have done a lot of dodgy things in this cabinet. There is, as you mentioned, I mean, James Cleverly. I just didn't understand why he kept James Cleverly. And it really confused me because a lot of the key roles are taken up by people that do not sit near the center ground at all. They're taken up by very, very right-wing people who are going to be the ones that have serious control over policy in this country. And I think what Rishi Sunak was trying to do is put kind of the people from different factions high up and then pack the rest of the cabinet with people he agreed with so that he could get the majority of cabinet. But there is a real risk with that because then you run, for example, Suella Braverman has the whole of Home Office policy in her hands. That is a really scary thought to have with somebody who was sacked just 2 weeks ago for a break in ministerial code. And then, I mean, yeah, it's very worrying.
Yeah, it's also really unpalatable considering that he kind of started off saying that this was going to be a premiership of these 3 words. Integrity, that was what he's going to beat Johnson on, and he's put someone back who was fired, just a serious breach in the Home Office, which is one of those roles that you need to take seriously. But I think Sunak kind of did unifying to the extreme, to the point that he's kind of compromised the entire aim of the cabinet, which was a fresh start for the Conservative Party, and he brought back people which is a laughable concept, but he's brought back people who we've seen before, but unfortunately for not great reasons. And I get bringing the Trussites back in, Therese Coffey, James Cleverly, Nadeem Zahawi. But the issue is that we don't have very good public electorate don't really like these people. And the issue with that is that when he wanted to start off fresh, you've got people like Cleverly in, Nadeem. I don't think it's a great start, to be honest.
I think what I'll say is that the most important cabinet position right now is the Chancellor. And I think on that, he got it absolutely right. I think keeping Jeremy Hunt for continuity, but also as well, his attitude to economic policy, I think will be extremely helpful. I mean, you saw that in how he restored the markets instantly when he was appointed by Liz Truss. I think there's some more minor positions that I kind of support as well. I think Johnny Mercer coming back to being Veterans Minister is a welcome addition. But I think Rishi Sunak, like you say, Danielle, I think he's gone too hard to try and appeal to those far right ERG think tank groups of people. And I think if Rishi Sunak fails in any other way, I think that's a reason we can put down to why he might fail in foreign policy or health, for example.
Yeah. I think if we're honest though, he could have appointed Penny Mordaunt to Home Secretary. I think he probably could have gotten away with that instead of Suella Braverman, because he still has a lot of right-wing figureheads in that cabinet, even without Suella Braverman. I mean, Steve Baker still has a role in government, not in cabinet, but in government. You still have these key figures dotted around government departments. So I don't really understand why he didn't do that, because I think there's going to be a lot of moderates. I mean, the conservative moderate faction have probably been unhappy for a long, long time, considering what's happened with Brexit. I mean, it's a very much a long-term push away from the centre ground, and Rishi Sunak is not a U-turn back towards the centre ground. He's still continuing in the same tack that the last 3 conservative governments have gone with, and I think that's what's clear with this cabinet.
Right. He has put some people in with a bit of experience, which I think, as I said previously, will help him out a bit. Yeah. Gavin Williamson, or Sir Gavin Williamson, seems to come back to haunt us. But Michael Gove is back in Levelling Up, which I guess means good news for Levelling Up, because he tends to be one of the more competent Conservative PMs. So I think if we could give him credit just to balance it out, I would say he's given some people with experience, some roles in his cabinet, which I think is a good thing.
On that, I'd say the reason he's done that is because he has he is quite inexperienced. Obviously, he was Chancellor, and, that is, it's a tall order to be a cabinet during COVID-19, to be Chancellor during COVID-19. There's no question about that. But outside of that, he doesn't really have much experience. I think he was in the Treasury Department before that, and then he was a very low minister. I think it was local government minister before that. That's his only government experience. He's not particularly experienced. He doesn't have a kind of grasp on a lot of different departments. Like, we don't know what he would do in health policy, in foreign policy, in policing, in education. There's so many massive questions over this government, and he's been pretty clear with some of the policy decisions. The environment, it's not going to be on his priority list. Education, probably not going to be on his priority list. Health remains to be seen, but I doubt it'll be on his priority list. What's going to be on his priority list is obviously the economy. He'll want to balance the books, and he'll do that by making tough decisions. And he's been very clear that he's going to make tough decisions, and that could be very worrying for a lot of people in this country, I think.
Right.
I think, speaking on the point of experience, I mean, he only came into office in 2015 as an MP for Richmond. He took over William Hague's seat, I think, when he stood down. So I think just to see his tectonic rise up to becoming Chancellor in 2020 kind of gives to the testament of the character of Rishi Sunak as someone who I see as pragmatic. I mean, I think there is the issue of his image, which I think will probably be his Achilles heel, and the fact that, he's so wealthy that he can't keep in touch with the working class at all right now. But I don't think there's this magical Churchill type politician in British politics, for example. I don't think you're going to get that for a while. I mean, factions already started to show when you saw the expulsion of MPs, Conservative Party MPs in 2019. I think it was 22 or something, these type of one nation left-wing Tories. And that's that set about the change of where the Tory party moved farther and further to the right after Cameron. And now they can't really go back from that point. I think they either have to stick through this until the next general election, but they can't switch around and do a massive U-turn, if you will, back to a more centre ground position, because that upsets the ERG, for example. That upsets the Tory donors. I mean, Rishi Sunak is someone that's very conflicted in what he has to do, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. particularly with his attitude to the protesters and the strikes, it's not in line with the public at all, considering that we've seen the public majority support the rail strikes, and they're in favour of people receiving real-term pay rises, which is something that many working people feel across the employment sector. And I think if we carry on with this, this rhetoric about the lunacy and the scroungers and the strivers, it seems out of place considering the public mood at the time. And I'm not sure, like Finlay said, his image is already something that's quite controversial, and I'm not sure if he carries down this kind of extreme Thatcherite kind of trust path with things like immigration and things such as employment and strikes. I'm not sure how that's going to help him.
Maybe we finish on this. Can Rishi Sunak win the next general election? Danielle?
No, I don't think so. And no, I don't think so. I don't think he has the time. And also, on a sadder point, I think he'll lose for one of the reasons that he can't control, which is unfortunately kind of plays into his race. And I think we've seen that. I don't know if you watched that LBC interview, but many Conservative Party members, and by means not all, absolutely, I'm not going to put out a generalised statement, but many do not see Rishi Sunak as British. And obviously that plays into the old imperial argument, you can't be British if you're not white. And I think, unfortunately, that's going to hurt him, particularly in the red wall seats that the Conservatives stocked up during Johnson's tenure. So I think that will be one of his heels that he comes down on, which is unfortunate, but very true.
Will he win? Or can he win?
Very unlikely. I think it's a possibility. I mean, you never know from how things can turn out, but I think it's going to be a real tough job. You just have to wait and see. I think the main point to take away is that he has stabilized his position, which Truss did not manage to do.
Yeah. Finlay?
I think he's more likely to win elections than Liz Truss. I think that's for certain right now. But I think Danielle hit the nail on the head about Rishi Sunak's race. I think some areas of the British public still kind of have that confusion or kind of skepticism about, I think Danielle went into much greater detail on it. But I think there's 2 years now until the next general election. I think what he does with the economy will kind of define his premiership, because he was elected to mainly solve the cost of living crisis. And I think these next 2 years are going to be important. I'm not saying anything for certain because I don't want to kind of nail my colours to the mast and be proved horribly wrong by saying he is going to win, or not. But I think at the moment, the Tory party is a sinking ship, and Labour have got such an open goal that they need to try to convert. And I think these next 2 years will be incredibly important. Yeah.
I don't want to write him off too early, but I think the gap is slimming and slimming for the Conservatives to win. I think the issue of his money and his background, as we've touched on, will be a problem. I think people are really gonna see him as kind of this metropolitan elite figure, which I don't really like the term, and I think it's a bit two-dimensional. And I think just judging him based on how much money he has is probably not particularly great. But again, some of the things he's done with his taxes, I think people are right to criticize, and that's where that's going to be his issue. His issue is going to be one of image rather than one of policy, I think. And that's what the next general election will probably, I don't know, it's again 2 years away, but that's what I think one of the issues of the next general election will certainly be fought upon.
Yeah, and also I think the Conservatives have kind of a romanticised view of the electorate where they assume that people will just forget, the Truss premiership. I know they kind of put it off as a footnote in their history, but people don't forget the time that they weren't able to buy their first house because their mortgage rate got removed, or the time that their interest rates sky high and they couldn't put food on the table for their children. We know government competency and economic management comes up when we vote on the ballot. And I think that's another thing that they'll struggle with, and particularly Sunak will struggle with in the general election.
Great. I think that's about it. We'll see what happens. It's 2 years away. let's see what happens in the next few weeks. First of all, we'll be covering it here. Subscribe, like the video. I mean, go and read one of the articles on our website, or follow us on Instagram, or do something like that. That'll be great. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to all of you for coming. We appreciate it. See you later.